Tucker Carlson had an interview recently with former, I guess he's former. I think Aaron Rodgers is on the injured reserve list. Maybe he'll be back this season. Anyway, NFL quarterback Aaron Rodgers, where they talk about a number of things. There's three different topics I want to reflect on with this interview. The first one is free speech. The second one is his criticism of the left. This is interesting. And last but not least, he has some things to say about Russia. Let's start with the free speech issue. So for you guys that are not aware, Aaron Rodgers was one of the people that I feel was heavily smeared in mainstream media during the pandemic because he had a different opinion when it came to the jab. You know, we can only go so far with that on this. So he was heavily smeared in reference to that. But prior to that, what some people may not be aware of is that Aaron Rodgers also received criticism when he actually supported and vocally supported Black Lives Matter movement. And I don't know if everyone remembers this, but he was one of the football players. He was probably one of the first white football players to come out publicly supporting Black Lives Matter movement. And he was also ridiculed by some people and some fans for that as well. Let's go ahead and get into this interview here.
And, you know, you see it on Bobby just released a video, 30-minute video, and about who he is that got censored by Facebook, which is just wild. I mean, they're censoring the election stuff, which we know has gone on, which you know, the Cambridge Analytica, if you've watched that documentary about what happened, it is just pretty wild, the world that we live in, where there's a, you know, for the idea of even free speech and what is it is called into a question all the time. I just read an interesting book that was written a few years ago called The Coddling of the American Mind. And it basically is talking about what's going on at college campuses, which we're seeing now. All this, you know, this outrage and different things that started post 2016 when Trump got elected, when campuses felt like they needed to create safe spaces because speech is violent. You know, certain types of rhetoric is actually violent. So we're vilifying the opinions now, and we're.
Yeah, but I hate to tell you this, Aaron, and this is interesting because Tucker Carlson doesn't bring this up during the interview, which I wish he would have. I hate to tell you this, Aaron, but when you talk about free speech and you mention RFK Jr., you have to realize also that RFK Jr. doesn't really fully support free speech either when you implement Israel. Once you insert Israel, and he's on record saying these things himself. He's on record saying these things himself. So once, you know, this Israel's assault on Gaza, we got to see just how much RFK Jr. supposedly cares about free speech. So I know that Aaron Rodgers supports RFK Jr. And at one point he was in the running to be his VP. At the same time, RFK Jr. isn't pro free speech either. He supports the crackdowns on the college campuses. He supports censoring and silencing these students. He supports protecting Israel at all costs. So there's that. And Tucker Carlson doesn't mention that. There's no pushback from what I saw in this interview.
Canceling people based on what they believe. And that's a slippery slope to go down, whether you cancel somebody who's, you know, super racist or you know, against the opinion that you believe in. Like, none of that actually works. Ignoring the shit you don't want to listen to or be a part of is one thing. But like picking and choosing what to censor is a very slippery slope. And you being in the media, you know how important it is to get people on all different sides.
Well, you can't.
So yeah, that's a good point, what he said there. And so if I was speaking to Aaron Rodgers, I would say you're right. Like picking and choosing what you're going to censor is a slippery slope. But your buddy, RFK Jr. is doing just that. And see, this is where Tucker does not come in with the pushback.
Can't have democracy if people can't say what they think.
But democracy in general, I mean, this country was founded as a constitutional republic,
yes,
which empowers the civil liberties. You know, democracy
you can't
is
have
always
self-government unless people are not slaves, unless they're free.
But you know, I mean, democracy always falls into fascism and tyranny and ultimately dictatorship.
Unfortunately, I'm aware of that.
And that's where we're at now.
Why do you? Oh, I'm aware. Why do you think that is? Why do you think and a lot of 19th century sort of free-minded people in Europe looked over at what was happening in the newly minted United States and said that's going to become a dictatorship ultimately. Why do you think that happens?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think entitlement is a big part of our society that has been a cancer for us, because people believe that their opinion is more important than somebody else's opinion. It was weaponized against people who chose not to get the vaccine. People would say your freedom isn't more important than mine.
We'll skip over that part because he goes into that part, but I agree with him on that issue. And then I want to get to this part of the interview here where he starts to push back on the left. Listen to this. This is funny.
How did you run an athletic track? How did you come to these conclusions? That's the more unusual.
Well, I think it was a number of things. I always wanted to question what I believed because I felt like it could strengthen that.
Yes.
And although that wasn't maybe the thought process growing up in the church, there was a lot to like just believe this and have faith. Don't ever question it. If you question it, that's doubt, and doubt is a sin. But I was like, I don't know. Like, I kind of want to question this so I can have it confirmed.
So I do agree with him there in reference to like growing up in the church. And if you guys grew up in the church, you might understand this as well. But like at one point, like I wasn't always Pentecostal, but at one point I did go to a Pentecostal church. And I don't know if any of you have ever gone to a Pentecostal church, but it was very strict. I was not there for long. I was not there for long, but it was very strict in the sense that, similar to what Aaron Rodgers said there, is like once you started asking questions, like that was considered taboo. You were not supposed to question. So if you were to ask questions about certain scriptures in the Bible, like you would actually be ridiculed for that, because that was considered, what he said, that means you're casting doubt, and to cast doubt is a sin. So I'm like, we can't ask me questions. Because one of the questions that I had was, I don't think it's cool. Like, I was like, why is it that, we have this rule where the women can't wear pants, but the guys can wear pants? But if you're thinking about the Bible days, didn't Jesus wear robes? So why can't we wear? And it was just, like that was like a really bad question to ask, apparently. Like I had other questions too, like why we can't wear makeup, why we can't wear jewelry, like all these kind of things. And they would point to like these scriptures in the Bible that was from like the Old Testament that was clearly, based on your interpretation. And then you also have to consider the timing for when that was produced compared to today. And I felt like they weren't willing to do that. But asking these questions, it kind of got you in trouble. Hence why I was not there long.
Can I just point out that on the cross, as he was being tortured to death, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Right.
Jesus said that. So the idea...
He had some doubt. Yeah.
On the cross.
Yeah. But I got into...
So I think you're allowed to ask questions and have doubt.
Well, yeah. I kind of gave myself that permission when I was younger. But I did a report my sophomore year in high school on JFK, and I was just kind of super fascinated by his charisma and the Kennedy family in general.
Yes.
And then his death and what little I knew about it. And I talked to some people that maybe didn't believe the Warren Commission or the official narrative. So I did a report on it. It was more on JFK because I think we had to pick an influential person from history to report on. So I picked JFK. And
in high school.
And back then, with very limited internet access, I did a lot of research in the library and read a lot of things, read the Warren Commission, a decent amount of it, the Warren Report, and I was like, there's some bullshit in here. This doesn't make sense. You tell me this magic bullet from this guy went boom, 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 through him, and then they just happened to find it, in the hospital, a certain spot. I was like, that doesn't sound right. So that kind of got me into questioning things, conspiracies, for sure, questioning things. I've seen some really interesting UAP phenomenons in the sky. I've talked about it, and I know that's something that you are fascinated by. But, at the time, I also found a way to see the Zapruder film, which was very fascinating as well. even though it's super grainy. And that kind of got me into questioning things. And then there's been a lot of really interesting things that have happened over the years. My grandfather, though, he, I didn't get to know him that well, but I do know that he always questioned and believed that Roosevelt knew about the Japanese coming. And that
one's really interesting, that Roosevelt knew about the Japanese coming, but I think you guys can see where it's heading, right? For Aaron Rodgers, he's kind of been placed in this camp of, some people consider him to be a conspiracy theorist now. And I will say, in reference to what he said about JFK, that one's an interesting one. I mean, I'm pretty sure, how many of you had to write a book report on JFK at some point when you were in school? Like I did, right? Yeah. So I noticed with that one in particular, our teachers were very picky about which book you could actually use to cover JFK. So there are certain books that they would say, oh, no, you can't, because that's not true. None of that happened. But it's funny because I look back on that now. And if I could talk to my former history teacher today, I would tell her, like, well, they're saying a lot of these things were true about JFK's death now. But back then, at that point in time, it was like, no, you can't use, Sabrina, you can't use that book. Interesting.
Stuck with him because he was super patriotic. And another one of my heroes, Pat Tillman, who left the NFL to join the Army, his death is very suspicious as well, in that, not the fact we know that he was killed by friendly fire, but the way they handled his body afterwards, his uniform, confiscating his last journal, using his death to prop up the war propaganda. There's been a lot of great people in history who are super patriotic, who've questioned their government, and I think that's what I've done since since I was a kid.
And pardon my ignorance, I didn't even know that about Tillman's journal. So that was confiscated by
his uniform was burned, and his journal was confiscated. That's in John Krakauer's book, Where Men Win Glory, which is a fantastic book. And one of my best friends in the entire world, AJ Hawk, AJ grew his hair out, him and his buddy, in 2004, as an ode to Pat, because Pat always had long hair, played for the Cardinals, left a multi-million-dollar contract to go fight Al Qaeda and Taliban.
One of the things that's interesting about this is that, again, why would they take his journal? Why would they take his journal and burn his uniform? What was in that journal that the government didn't want you to see? It's just a journal, right?
Gets over.
I wonder if there were war crimes mentioned in that journal.
There, and it's like, what the fuck am I doing? I'm guarding these poppy fields. This is not what I signed up for. I miss my wife. I miss being in the States. This is not what I thought we were going to be doing over here. And then some really negligent maneuvers happened and split up his unit. And he ended up being with one of the members of the Afghani army, who was their kind of guide. And, a guy saw the guy in some dim lighting on the ridge, who was with Pat. They fired on him. Obviously, Pat and the Afghani thought that they were getting fired on by Taliban, so fired back, and ended up Pat got killed. His brother was not told right away that it was friendly fire. It's all in the book. It's a fascinating book. It's one of the only books I've ever cried reading, just because it's so. John's an incredible writer. He wrote Into Thin Air. He wrote Into the Wild. He wrote Under the Banner of Heaven.
I read those three. I never read the Tillman book.
Yeah, the Tillman book is incredible. But I don't know why I'm bringing this up. Just that there's so many people that really love this country that have gotten disenfranchised. I think that's part of it.
Who've been betrayed by their leaders.
Yeah.
I mean, for your grandfather, who you said lost friends at Pearl Harbor, and was shot down over Europe and held as a POW by the Nazis. And
he, recently there's a gentleman writing a book about me, and he's writing a chapter on him, and he went and found the war crime committee that actually interviewed him after he came back because he was mistreated over there. There was one of his one of the guys. There was a group of I think there were 10 people on his bomber. One of the guys ruptured his spleen on the way down, and they mistreated him. Made him march 20 miles in the freezing cold. Didn't get him any medical treatment. So there was like a war crimes commission that was doing interviewed. So he was interviewed about that. And it talked about kind of how he was treated, how they put, worms in his food and didn't in water for certain times and just the bad conditions they were in. And that's all he went through. He went through all that because, he really cared about his country. And I think even up until his death, there was for sure some bitterness, I would guess, around what was I actually doing and why was I doing it and who had to die, my friends at Pearl Harbor, for this country that I fucking love, that I almost died for.
That's right.
And I think those are the great people that have made this country what it is. And we're, now to even question the government, you're some like right-wing conspiracy, crazy tinfoil hat wearer.
So this part right here, questioning the government, right? So you should question your government, but he has a point here where he says, like, now if you do that, like, you're a loony or whatever. I mean, like, come on, like the same government that lied to us about the war in Iraq. I mean, why wouldn't you ask questions? That the way that they're screaming and to the rooftops of all the people that are protesting in support of, Palestinian people in Gaza. I mean, why are you shocked? For all the people who are surprised, like, I can't believe those kids are out there and I can't believe what they're saying. Why are you shocked? Why are you shocked that, and particularly a younger generation, they're not willing to just sit back and just believe what the government is telling them anymore? And for those of you who are around during the Iraq war, why would you believe what the government is telling you in reference to these foreign conflicts abroad? I thought we all learned this lesson. That's why it's interesting to me how many people weren't willing to question, the Russia-Ukraine war, how some people aren't willing to question what Israel was doing to Gaza. It was interesting to me, if you were alive during that time, during the Iraq war, and that our government lied to us about that war, I just don't understand why you would just trust what the government is saying today about foreign conflicts right now.
Which is wild, because it seems like the left has gone so far left, and anybody right of that, there's no center anymore. That's according to the left. You're a right winger, unless you're so far on the left. The left used to be a party of Occupy Wall.
So let me go back a little bit here. Just this part right here about the left, because I think what he says here, it's important, but I think he gets something wrong.
Up until his death, there was for sure some bitterness, I would guess, around what was I actually doing and why was I doing it and who had to die, my friends at Pearl Harbor, for this country that I fucking love, that I almost died for.
That's right.
And I think those are the great people that have made this country what it is. And we're, now to even question the government, you're some like right-wing conspiracy, crazy tinfoil hat wearer, which is wild, because it seems like the left has gone so far left, and anybody right of that, there's no center anymore. That's according to the left. You're a right winger, unless you're so far on the left. The left used to be a party of Occupy Wall Street,
of course,
and free speech and rights for everybody.
So again, the left, he's referring to the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party is not left. See, this is something that, it irks my brain when I hear people say this and they describe the left as this. That's not the left. Right. And so notice what he added in there. He said there's no center anymore. See, I'm always weary when I hear people say, why there is no center anymore. What's wrong with the center? Chris Cuomo says this. Why can't we all just meet in the middle? Why can't we just come to the center and not be far left or far right? Center protects the status quo. So when you hear someone say that about the center, they want to protect the status quo. They want to protect capitalism. So think about the class that Aaron Rodgers is a part of, and then ask yourself how someone who is sitting there and they're so wise when it comes to calling out, the government and war and all these other issues and free speech. But when it comes to, we're talking about where you sit politically, is like, we can't there's no center anymore. That's because at the end of the day, Aaron Rodgers still wants to protect his status and his wealth. Does that mean that Aaron Rodgers is running around driving like Beamers and showing off his money? No. And in fact, a lot of people that are wealthy don't do that. But what he is telling you is that he does not want to go too far to the left. He also doesn't want to go too far to the right. He wants to be in the center, and the center protects the status quo. We must always remember that. The center is not going to, when we talk about wealth, the center is not going to push back on the wealthy in such a way where they should be pushed back and have them pay their fair share of taxes. The center is going to protect capitalism.
Now they're the ones beating the drums on the war machine and censorship and obedience.
They're not criticizing Wall Street too much, I notice.
Yeah.
There was
because that's not the left. Again, that's the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party supports Wall Street. They support corporate interests. They support the military industrial complex. The Democratic Party supports those things. They're not against it, right? I think we have one more piece here.
Fascinating study, a very revealing study that showed that at the height of Occupy Wall Street, the New York Times torqued up its coverage of racism. So the word racist, racism, white supremacy went up hundreds of percent in the New York Times. You can check all this on their database. During Occupy Wall Street, it was almost like somebody decided it would be better to be at war with each other than to be asking questions about our financial system.
Occupy Wall Street actually was a good, and just think about if it received even more attention as of today, because we didn't have as much social media during Occupy Wall Street. But imagine Occupy Wall Street now, right? With TikTok and everything else, like it would be even bigger. But I felt like Occupy Wall Street did have the right idea. They were going after the 1%, right? And we remember who shut that down. Obama shut that down. A lot of these, I would say, progressive like actions that we had on the ground, or if it wasn't us, if it was, the NBA strike, etc. Obama came in and just had a conversation with someone and just shut it down. Every time.
It's not surprising. That's what they do. That they distraction. The true disinformation comes from actually those publications now.
How have they treated you?
Okay, so we know about that part about how they treated him. I told you about that. And then there's the part here about Russia and Joe Biden that I wanted to mention for just a second as well. I thought this was pretty interesting.
You did one of the most controversial, somehow, not to me, most controversial interviews in the last, I don't know how long, when you went to Russia and did Putin. How did it feel coming back? Because like anybody who watched the interview was like, number one, it was fucking awesome. Number two, Putin came off as an interesting, thoughtful, smart individual. And if you've read 1984, you know the base game plan of government control is you have to have an enemy and you have to slander that enemy regardless if you know anything about him. And I think
Careful, Aaron. So they might start calling you a Putin puppet if you do. They may start calling you a Putin puppet. But he's right. So it's obviously he watched that interview with Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. I did too. You guys know we covered that on the show. And I just remember like how many people were just so angry that that conversation even took place, And it's just crazy when you think about it.
A lot of people are like, oh, Putin apologists are like, whitewashing all the stuff that he's done to the different people. And I was just like, no, I'd love to see Joe Biden give an interview where he can speak on the history of the United States in the same way that Putin talked about the history of his country.
I don't think that'll happen. That would be very funny if Joe Biden had an interview where he had to talk about the history of the United States, because number one, Joe Biden doesn't do many interviews. Have you guys noticed that? He doesn't do that many interviews. And then two, I could just see him getting a lot of historical facts wrong, just like he said he marched with civil rights leaders back in the day, which he obviously did not. I could see him getting the names wrong. It would just be a disaster, huh? Or I would like to see Joe Biden sit down with a conversation with Vladimir Putin. I would like to see that. I'd like to be a fly on that wall. I would like to be on that one.
I'd love to see Biden do an interview where he shows how to operate a microwave, and I don't think that's going to happen. And by the way, Biden won't do interviews, and neither will Zelensky so far.
But what was it like to come back and you were like in a couple other places after that?
Yeah, I went to the Middle East after that for a while. I mean, I was out of the country for almost a month, so I missed. And I don't ever read about myself anyway because I know who I am. I don't need someone to tell me. So I missed all of that, as I always do. But the idea that someone would criticize an interview where you just let the guy talk for a couple hours. I mean, I just think that's inherently useful. I mean, I just wanted to do it as a documentary record of what Putin is like, or at least what he's like in this context, and people can decide for themselves. I'm a big believer in letting people decide for themselves. I think adult men have the right to come to their own conclusions about things. Adults have the right to. So I'll never stop believing that because we're not slaves. We can have any opinion we want. And if you don't like it, then try and change it through reason. And if you can't, then fuck you. And I really feel that way. So that's the kind of perspective I had going in to talk to Putin. My perceptions of him are exactly what you just said. I thought he was an interesting guy, smart guy, impressive guy, in some ways, obviously a lot more impressive than Joe Biden, but he's Russian and he runs Russia, and I'm American and I live in America. So I care about my country. I want my leaders to be better. I'm not on Putin's side. I don't have any emotional attachment to any foreign country, because I'm not a foreigner. I'm an American, and this is the only country I care about. But for the record, yeah, I thought people can watch it and assess for themselves.
And they should. It's a fascinating.
But the
interview.
idea that you shouldn't be allowed to do that is so crazy to me. I'm just not going to submit to that.
Being canceled by the people who have just bowed down and given interviews from their knees to the Zelenskys of the world.
Gargling as they interview, yes.
So that part right there, I think is important too. And that was one thing that I think I had a problem with. It's okay to interview Vladimir, I say his name right? Vladimir. It's okay to interview Vladimir Zelensky, but it's not okay to interview Vladimir Putin. And I think that it's important to get the other side. And our government doesn't want us to hear the other side of the countries that they consider to be our enemies, right? They don't want us to hear their perspective. And I think that we could all do better, and we would all be actually better off if we did hear the perspective of these leaders of these countries that our government tells us we should not listen to. I mean, why don't they want us to hear what they have to say? What is it about us that they don't want us to know? It's something you got to think about. But I thought that interview is actually a little over 2 hours, so it's some time. But I thought it was pretty interesting. It's really, I don't know. Like Aaron Rodgers is, he's different. He's different. But it's like I listened to that interview and I could hear some of the things he's saying, and I'm like, yeah, he's making really good points throughout this interview. But it just seemed like in some spaces, like he could not connect that back. Like, for example, talking about free speech, and it's dangerous to actually decide what you're going to be allowed to say and what you can't say. But then saying, RFK Jr., they tried to censor him, but RFK Jr. also wants censorship too. So it's like tying that back to some of the other things. And if it were me having that interview with Aaron Rodgers, I would have mentioned that to him. I would have said that to him. But here we are. Let's get the comment on Rumble, Eric. Boop, boop, boop. Thank you. All right. Thank you for the comment on Rumble, the Rumble rant. Reposter, not joking. Kalinsky's endorsement makes me suspicious about Jill Stein. Peace. Yeah, I think I heard that from some people too. Some people feel that way now. I don't know. I'm not suspicious about Jill Stein, but it was interesting to me that he decided to go that route. Let's go to some of the comments here. Skylar says, oh, wow, I didn't know Aaron Rodgers was down for the BLM cause. Yeah, he was actually. If you Google it, I think he was with the Green Bay. He was one of the more vocal. I mean, obviously, of course, Colin Kaepernick, but I mean, in reference to like the white football players, he was one of the more vocal ones. I remember that. Thank you for the super chat, Mary Rose. Typo, Bison is a beautiful truth teller. Thank you for that. Ryan, Sabs, imagine what answers are lost because the right people don't want to ever see it. Yeah. This is why sometimes I just wish I could be a fly on the wall. So I could just like, what happened there? What really happened? Wanker Tanker says there is no mainstream left in the US. You're correct, Wanker Tanker. You're correct.